Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL week number 5 overview and analysis video in the summer split. We are really nearing our end here in the regular season already for basically every region that we cover, but especially for the LPL. Only one regular season week to talk about after week number 5. So we are really coming up on the end of the split, and you need to start getting your ass into gear if you want to try and be a team that has a lot of momentum going into playoffs or to secure your placement going into those play-in stages. There's a lot to talk about. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you expect from this week, and did it live up to your expectations? Always very curious to know your thoughts and opinions down there. But without further ado, let's jump into the content. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover. And at the end of the video, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We'll be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 14 at the end of the video as well, but as you guys know, most of today is going to be spent talking about the games themselves. As a reminder, still casting for LPL English. If you want to see me talk about some of these series live, I actually will be live tonight, or I guess through the night, as this video is getting posted, essentially, a couple hours after I think this video is getting posted. So if you're interested in, maybe seeing me cast live, check out the links in the description to the YouTube and the Twitch for LPL English. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the analysis, and that kicks off with day number 1. We started with a Group Nirvana matchup between Ultra Prime and Ninjas in Pyjamas, and NIP are going to pick up the 2-0 series win. This is honestly a bit unexpected, not because NIP are bad or anything like that, or that we thought they would lose this series, but more so because NIP are notorious for going to Game 3, and so are Ultra Prime. It's just that both of them kind of flip-flop in terms of, what they are in Game 3. NIP almost always wins their Game 3s, and Ultra Prime almost always loses their Game 3s, but no Game 3 required in this particular series because NIP was just a tad bit more dominant in terms of how things broke down. This really just was a jungle gap. I think that's really the easiest way to surmise exactly how to talk about this series as a whole. Nio was so much better than Junhao in terms of how this jungle matchup ended up going that it's really difficult to kind of focus or prioritize any other lane. NIP was clearly ahead of Ultra Prime in terms of their positioning, in terms of their pressure throughout this series. Not to say there weren't other parts that were going well for NIP, just that was really the main one. So we're going to focus on it because Nio is player of the series here on both the Vi, but especially the Viego in game number 2. He really was just able to completely take over the game. It was honestly staggering just how much he was pushing NIP forward. And I think I'm really starting to buy into Nio as like an actually great jungler. We'll see how things end up going. I don't want to try to make like overarching statements just in terms of, oh, he's going to be the next superstar. Like I don't feel the same way about Nio that I do about someone like Monkey, where I think you put Monkey on a better team, and I think he is a player that you could expect to try and make worlds, or at least be in the contention to try to make worlds. But what I do think is that going up against weaker competition so far in Group Nirvana, he has looked just about as good as you could possibly look, and he has really revitalized Ninjas in Pyjamas. He has been the best player on this team this split. That's not debatable. He's been better than Doinby, he's been better than Leave, he's been better than Solo Kill, he's been better than Niket. He has been the most important player on Ninjas in Pyjamas, and I think that is obviously really good to see as a carry. And I think, again, going back to some of the analysis I gave at the beginning of the split, Doinby really wants a carry in the jungle. He wants someone that he can facilitate and that he can enable so he can play Galio and Orianna and a lot of these less aggressive carry-oriented picks. He had to do so much of the heavy lifting for NIP that even Doinby is now playing a ton better, or at least a lot more comfortable in the mid lane. He's doing really well in lane in terms of his laning stats, and I think he's translating that well to the map overall. So Nio, Doinby, I think pairing up really, really well as a duo, and I think making each other better. Solo Kill also had a hell of a series here against Ultra Prime, one of his best throughout this split. He really kind of pseudo broke out over the course of spring. I know a lot of people that would talk about him as like a very interesting player to watch after the spring split. I've been on the train for a lot longer than everybody else, going back to his time last year on Edward Gaming. I really liked what I saw out of him individually when a lot of people didn't in terms of what his performances looked like, but I think he is starting to come into his own, and he was much, much better than Jiang in this series. So that's obviously huge. Leave and Niket, I think, have stabilized. Leave has honestly become this really good late game carry for this team. He's kind of taken more of a backseat role because Nio has become so much more of a carry for this roster, and Honestly, I have no problems with that. That's best case scenario for someone like Leave. Limit the bad plays, maximize the good plays. That's always been the thing with Leave. Niquette's fit in fine. I don't think he's been great. I don't think he's been terrible. He's kind of just been a part of this team. But Ninjas in Pyjamas are for sure better than what they were last split, and they're going to get more of a chance to prove that later on in the week. And for Ultra Prime on the other side, obviously you're a bit frustrated by this loss, if only because you are fighting it out to get a top 4 spot. And just as it feels like you are playing for a top 4 spot and in one of those positions, you end up losing a matchup like this, which is very unfortunate and pretty poorly timed, but you can't really be shocked that you lost to one of the top 2 teams in the group. Top 2 are clearly separated from everybody else, at least in my opinion, when it comes to Group Nirvana, and Ultra Prime didn't really have a shot of being able to go up against NIP or EDG in terms of how things are going, so no real shocker there. The unfortunate part is that Junhao played poorly. I think that's the negative takeaway here for Ultra Prime, is that you kind of had hoped that Junhao would be a little bit better in this kind of performance. The fact that this was a jungle canyon and not, oh, it's bot lane losing or top lane losing or mid lane losing, the fact that it's specifically jungle, I think, is a bit frustrating if you're an Ultra Prime fan, because I think that's the one lane you're looking at as potentially good enough to be able to compete with the upper, standings, but very much not the case here. The Xin Zhao, the Wukong in particular in Game 2, just not working out overall. So not the best series for Junhao, probably his worst of the split up until this point. Saber continues to be nothing in the mid lane. If anything, he's a liability. He's pretty much exclusively playing these roamers now, even though he's an assassin player and he looks terrible on the roamers, but he's not talented enough to be able to carry games on assassins. It's just kind of a catch-22 for him as a player that is really struggling right now. Jiang, I think, has never really shown the promise that we hoped from him out of the PCS. His mechanical skill is definitely there, but like the consistency is just not, unless I'm casting. Apparently the only games he ever plays well, I'm on the desk for. Maybe I should just cast every Ultra Prime series. And then Baya and Xiaoxia in the support position, they're just meh, right? Like they're fine. Like Xiaoxia is a player that I don't really like in the support position. I don't think he's particularly good, but Baya is fine. He's like your stereotypical slightly below average AD carry. I think he reminds me quite a bit of Savior for LGD, if that gives you any context. So Ultra Prime is what Ultra Prime is. Like at this point, they're going to lose to the good teams. They're going to potentially be in the running to beat the bad teams, but this team has certainly not guaranteed themselves top 4 in a play-in spot just yet. And for Ninjas in Pyjamas, right now the goal is still #1 in the group. It's going to be nearly impossible for them to get that because they are so far ahead in terms of EDG, in terms of games played, and so they're running through their schedule much quicker. It means EDG have a ton of time to adapt and react and try to get their record over the top no matter what happens the rest of the split, but NIP are certainly going to give it a good shot. Then moving on to our second series of day #1, and we move up to Group Ascent as we have a matchup between JD Gaming and FunPlus Phoenix, 2 teams in pseudo freefall mode right now, and it's JD Gaming who's able to stabilize in this matchup. They pick up a 2-0 win, and honestly, they look fantastic today. Everybody plays really well for JDG. They have a new support coming in, which I will talk about because this decision is baffling to say the absolute least, but we will at least give it a go in terms of a conversation. But for FPX, I mean, you want to talk about an org that's just completely crumbling at the current moment. FPX is the example for what happens when the org is completely mismanaged. And it's not just roster decisions. I think they've made some good roster decisions, and I'm going to disagree with Reddit and Twitter and, all of the, armchair analysts that like to talk on social media about some of their roster changes. I like the decisions that FPX made going into this split. I think Jiachi is an upgrade over Awesome. I think he's a better player down in the AD carry role. I think, keeping Jue was obviously huge for this organization. They would not be better if they had sold him to JDG or BLG or one of the teams he was trying out for, but at the end of the day, all the behind-the-scenes stuff is really starting to catch up to FPX, and it's really becoming a problem. And again, we'll talk about it. But starting with JDG, the winners of this series, player of the series for me is going to go to Pays in the bot lane. The Kaisa, the Varus, both of these games were really excellent from Pays, and boy, did we need to see this. We needed to see that the Pays we've seen all year long is still there, that he's still, it's still possible to bring that out of him, that he can still be one of, if not the best AD carry in the world, because at his best, that's what he is. Like, on his best day, this should be a meta that fits him perfectly. He is your, stereotypical hyper carry player. He is the best Zeri in the world. I will continue to die on that hill. So it still frustrates me to see them, obviously they play Varus because it's Varus, and Kaisa is Kaisa, so you want to pick that as well. But like, where are the hyper carries, man? Where are Smolder? Where is Zeri? Where is Jinx for Pays? Why are you not just leaning on him as a win condition for this team? It's felt very strange throughout this split that they have not wanted to do that, but Pays also has not necessarily paid JDG out in kind so far in the summer split. It felt like him and Wink could never really get on the same page, and that's perhaps why they make this decision to go in a different direction for the support position. But whatever ended up changing in this series, be it the roster itself or just the fact that they're going up against FPX, who's terrible, Pays looked incredible, and he definitely deserved player of the series, at least from my perspective. I do think it's worth pointing out Zhuo, though, because Zhuo is coming in as the new starting support, of course, formerly of LNG, throughout all of this year. This is a baffling decision. I mean, there is almost no explanation for why the team would do this, other than the fact that they needed to change supports. But if that's going to be the case, hell, I'd rather just bring back Missing. Like, you probably still have him under contract. I don't imagine that you just completely released him. And so if you just brought him back, like, even if he is not in good form and, you know, he's maybe not in game shape or whatever, right? Like, maybe he hasn't played a lot. I don't know. Like, there are a lot of rumors floating around. He's got to be better than Zhuo, who's just not a good player in any aspect. Like, he's had moments where I think he's looked like a slightly below average support at this level, and I've always talked about how it's hard to evaluate him because his AD carries are always so bad, specifically Photic. It's really hard to evaluate Zhuo when he has to play with one of the worst AD carries in the world in terms of a top-level player, but this is not the move I would have made. That being said, it certainly worked in the first series, and he outplayed Jway, but how much of that is JDG versus FPX, and how much of that is Zhuo actually being good? We're going to find out, I guess, later on as this guy gets more time. But this is a baffling decision. He got replaced on LNG by OVO, their LDL support, and it almost immediately looked like an upgrade for LNG. So again, we'll see how it goes, but at least for now, the bot lane ended up working out. Scout played really well in this series. Again, it's Care. That's the big caveat. Scout can't really beat any of the top mid laners right now, and Care, certainly not a player that you would put in that category, but Scout did have a good series, and especially on the Taliyah in Game 1, I think accomplished a lot. Xiaoshu was incredible on the Renekton in Game 2. He's probably been this team's best performer across this split, which is an insane thing to say, considering everything. And then Shun, you know, definitely was out jungling Milky Way and even IYY in Game number 2, but that's more FPX, which we'll get into. Overall, it's a nice win and a necessary one for JDG to stabilize at least a little bit, but I'm not sold on this team being back or anything like that just because they beat the worst team in Group Ascend. And speaking of the worst team in Group Ascend, let's talk about FPX. This team is a disaster. Everything is going wrong for them. There's almost nothing to talk about in a positive connotation when it comes to FPX right now. So much so that Milky Way, despite only playing game number 1, is going to get dud of the series here. It only feels fitting. This guy will not be playing the rest of this split. He gets replaced here in game number 2 by IYY, and then a bunch of allegations come out about him potentially match fixing. Last year, I believe in Demacia Cup is when they are accusing him of doing it. Whatever the case, honestly, this might be a blessing in disguise for FPX. That sounds like a terrible thing to say, but I'm an analyst channel. You know, I'm not going to sit here and talk about the moral repercussions of match fixing. Don't do that. You're stupid if you do that at this point. And obviously, last year was a bit of a different ball game, but we had an entire region shut down for match fixing. You just can't get away with this kind of thing. Clearly, it's a lot better to be an asshole on the internet than it is to match fix. Like, it just is what it is. Don't make this stupid mistake, but Milky Way probably going to be banned from the league at the very least for, you know, a good amount of time, like a year or so, if the procedures end up going the way that we expect them to. That means IYY is likely back in. That being said, this might make FPX better. This team has been a nightmare ever since Milky Way came in. He's been the worst version of himself. I definitely saw this coming. Like, I hate to say that. You know, I saw this coming even before the beginning of the year on RNG. You want to go back and watch my analysis on RNG in winter, you're going to see somebody who's really talking down on Milky Way and talking about how he likely cannot carry this team to being top 10 or being relevant in any conceivable way. That's exactly what ended up happening. He's been a nightmare all year long. All of the problems we saw at the end of 2024 have carried over and doubled in 2025. So who knows, man? He was terrible on the Jarvan, got completely out-jungled by Shun, and he's likely not coming back. But IYY stepping back in, you know, he's not good either. Like, that's the problem, is that even if he is a little bit better because he's so low resource that at least you can allow the bot lane to start playing a lot more aggressive again. Like, it's not like his mechanical skill is good. He is often just there for the macro. And honestly, like, even then, like, there are a lot of players that would be infinitely better. FPX is just not a very good team. I see a lot of people down-talking this bot lane, talking about how FPX downgraded in the AD carry role. You genuinely have to be crazy, in my opinion, to think that going from awesome to Jiachi is a downgrade. I just don't see how that could be possible anymore. Like, he didn't play well in this series, but this team is a disaster. Mid lane's getting run over. Sheer has regressed a ton from what he was last year. Like, Jway didn't play very well in this series. It's one of his weaker ones of the split. Like, everything's just going wrong. You want to talk about the AD carry role? I think it's just kind of crazy to make a blanket statement like that. But that being said, it's really hard to actually pin down what FPX is at the current moment, because what they feel like is a Group Nirvana team that's masquerading as a team in Group Ascend, even worse so than a team like Thunder Talk last split. I think they're even worse than something like that. And then for JD Gaming on the other side, obviously it's a nice win, but it's against FPX, who's a nightmare right now, and they have a lot of going on behind the scenes, so we'll see what ends up happening when they actually face good teams later on. Then moving on now to day number 2, our second day of the week, obviously here. And jumping into day 2, we start off with LGD Gaming taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas, and NIP pick up their second win of the week on day number 2. Like I said, NIP flying through their games. Their schedule is going to be over quite quickly in terms of how things end up breaking down. They have very few games to cover in next week's video, so it's going to be about getting the most you can out of these performances in terms of your overall record. You're already in a pretty big hole because you've gone to so many game 3s in terms of how things have broken down, so these 2-0s are very necessary, and picking one up here against LGD, who for all intents and purposes is the third best team in Group Nirvana, it's a really good thing to see. Now, LGD is not a good team, I want to make that pretty clear. They're fine, they're okay at what they do. I don't think they have a lot going for them, but if they had a better mid laner, I think perhaps you could maybe be looking at this team as something that's remotely relevant. The problem is they don't have a better mid laner. Mid lane at the Group Nirvana level is very difficult to find, and LGD have certainly not found it here in Xiaoqinghua, who has been nightmarish over the course of this split. I'm not really going to hold my words here, although I am going to talk a bit about the fandom kind of surrounding this series. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Niket is going to be the player who gets player of the series for me, mostly for the Alistair game in game 2, but the Nico was still very good in game 1 in terms of the engages. I like seeing him be able to be unlocked a bit more. This is probably his best series on Ninjas in Pyjamas, and I think we were really waiting for him to look better than PP God. I mean, he was better than PP God. He has been better than PP God because PP God was actively losing games for Ninjas in Pyjamas. Like, we let's not, cut the cord on anything else. Like, you can talk about this guy's past history on other teams, but so far this year, he was running it, sprinting it, quite frankly, for NIP, so it kind of needed to get him out of there, and Niket, I think, is really good at being able to stabilize in that position. I think he gives you a lot of upside in the support position as a really fun engage threat. He's not quite Jway, but I think him and Jway aren't far off from being kind of similar players. I think Jway is just much more advanced in terms of what he is as a player right now, but Niket is really fun to watch, and I'm really glad to see him finally get the opportunity to kind of prove that on a slightly bigger stage. Not that Group Nirvana isn't, but RNG was such a disaster at the beginning of the year, and he played for Ultra Prime. Like, he played for orgs that never really gave him the shot to be able to kind of prove that he was a good player. I think this is his best chance, and he's doing it right now. This was his best series. I still want to point out that the solo laners and the jungle were hugely positive. Massive jungle gap once again. Nio continuing to kind of run this division, and LGD in particular has no answer for their former jungler in Nio from last split. The Vi, the Pantheon looking great. Doingbi goes deathless and mega gaps Xiaoqinghua on the other side of this matchup. Galio, Talia, like, he really feels locked in terms of what the meta is for him. And I think now that he actually has a jungler he can play aggressive around, he feels so much more unlocked to just play everywhere on the map. Be that guy that won Worlds, again, in terms of just the way that he's pushing the game forward. Solo Kill had a fantastic week. 15, 4, and 9 throughout these 2 games. Sasa's a pretty good top laner in terms of his mechanics. The Udyr looked completely lost in game number 2. Not a good pick. Solo Kill, completely abusing that. And when Leave is the last player you're talking about on NIP, that's probably a good thing. So overall for NIP, very nice series, and for LGD, pretty bad series. Can't really defend a lot of the things that ended up happening here for them. I will say, I don't think everything on this team is a disaster. I still think there's something in the bot lane to be able to pull out, even if Savior and YCX I'm a little bit lower on than maybe Consensus. I'm certainly lower on YCX, maybe a bit higher on Savior in terms of what they are as players. I really think that Savior does a lot more in terms of this 2v2 than he gets credit for. YCX, I think, benefits quite a bit from having an aggressive player like Savior, but when they go up against an actually good bot lane that's going to be aggressive, they're not as good as those players. They're a slightly below average bot lane in total. Leave and Niket are clearly better. In the 2v2, Climber has really struggled. I think he's had moments, he's had flashes where things have looked good. He had like a 2 or 3 series stretch throughout this split where it was like, oh, okay, Climber's figuring it out, he's getting comfortable, but it's not really happening right now. A lot of junglers take until year 2 to figure things out. Maybe that will be the case for Climber. Sasa, I think, has regressed quite a bit from what he was not only at the beginning of the split, but last split as well, as a very fun, aggressive top laner. And really, I guess the main crux of it is Xiaoqinghua is just terrible in the mid lane. He's going to get done of the series. I think it's pretty reasonable to say he's the worst mid laner in the LPL. I think him and Haichao kind of duking it out for that argument. I think both of them are kind of bottom 2, just in terms of how things go. Maybe you could be really aggressive and put someone like Saber in there, but I think Saber, at the very least, doesn't lose you games in the same way that these two do. It's just not been very good, man. They end up replacing Haichao, obviously, for Xiaoqinghua. And, I think at this point, the experiment is over. There's really nothing that he looks good on. He got completely blasted on Azir in game 2. He went 0-7-0 in that second game going into NIP. That is nightmarish. And the Rise wasn't much better in game number 1. At least he was a part of plays in that one. But, at the end of the day, this has looked terrible in the mid lane. And Xiaoqinghua, I think, is certainly somebody that I would not be super interested in seeing again in the LPL going into next year. But we'll see how things end up breaking down. I do want to talk a bit about the overall, thoughts and feelings of the community around Nirvana. What's with the negativity, man? Why are you tuning into a group Nirvana game and then talking about how the teams are shit? Like, what are you trying to see here? Are you trying to be like, oh, we expected top tier gameplay from bottom 4 teams in the LPL? Obviously, that's not both of these teams, but like, you know what I mean? It just feels very strange to see every comment on every post-match thread or every, reply thread to this series just be so negative about the team's performances when I just don't really know what you were expecting. It really does feel like the entire LPL community loves to be negative for basically no reason around this time of the year. It's happened every year I've covered the LPL. Hopefully we can bring some positivity. It won't be coming through LGD, but it will be coming through NIP, who I think could very easily make playoffs in the form that they're in right now. There are multiple teams in the Group Ascend level that I think could lose to NIP right now. Obviously, FPX is one of them, but NIP very unlikely to get that #1 spot. If they can beat up on a team like Team WE, I honestly wouldn't really be shocked by that result either. So a lot to consider for NIP, a team that honestly is surging at the right time. Then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and it's another one where we can glean quite a bit of information from it. It's Weibo Gaming taking on Team WE, and Weibo Gaming is going to pick up the 2-1 series victory in this one. Obviously, they're the better team, but once again, WE being Game 1 merchants, this narrative just will not die for them. They continue to look really good when they have a lot of champions available to them, and then once Fearless starts to kick in, it looks like they end up falling off quite dramatically in comparison to a lot of the other teams at this level. It's obviously really disappointing to see from WE, a team that ended up finishing top 4 in the spring split, even if that was a bit of a miraculous playoff run, but they have completely and utterly fallen off and returned back to the norm in terms of what we were expecting at the beginning of the year. Any hype around this team potentially trying to push for a world spot, that's dead in the water. We already thought it would be going into this split with a potential top 7 finish. It's really dead now. They might not even be a top 8 team right now in the LPL. And for Weibo, while I do think they have problems, I think this team is still better than people are giving them credit for. I do still believe in the big 5 right now in the LPL. I believe that there are 5 genuinely good teams, even if 4 of them have proven to be a little bit more consistent. Weibo might be on the outside looking in terms of that big group, but I still think they deserve to be considered alongside them, and I still think they're going to be a threat to make the World Championships. And I think we see in a lot of these series why they're going to have that threat, because on any given day, they can have these incredible performances from a couple of players that are inconsistent. Crisp, kind of #1 on that list, I guess you could say. He's going to get player of the series here, mostly for the Braum in game number 3. This Braum was so omega strong. Look at the comp of WE in game 3 and tell me how they ever get through Braum in terms of the damage that they are putting out. It is very difficult for this game to be played, and Crisp ends up operating beautifully. Not only does he play defensively to be able to block a lot of the damage coming in from WE, but I think he does very well going on the offense as well, being a really big threat early on in the 2v2 to set light up to be able to carry the game relatively efficiently on the Xayah, and then of course, being effective at, dropping ultimates and making sure to space fights very well. I just think he played a great series. I think Crisp deserves a lot of credit. I think the Bard was also very good in game number 2. I talk about it all the time. Crisp gets memed on quite a bit, quite frequently, at least in the LPL community, and I think part of that is deserved and part of that is not deserved. I think he still is a good player. He's just not an elite support. It is what it is. He is, an upper tier, a B+, if you will, in terms of how things end up breaking down here. But I think encouragingly, Light didn't end up throwing this series. I think that's really going to be the make or break for Weibo. I've been so low on Light's performances over the course of 2025. I feel like his individual play has been very low, very bad, very poor throughout a lot of 2025. And so if he's going to be able to figure things out and get back on track, that's huge. Taeyun on the other side has been a disaster in summer so far. We'll see how that ends up, translating, because he, was expected to be this throughout the entirety of the year and then randomly became good in spring. But, we'll see. At least Light was able to pick up the win when his support was dominating and his enemy AD carry was inting his face off. But rest of the team was fine. Xiaohu, I think, looks pretty good in this meta. I think, again, he's another player who just kind of gets a bad reputation for being, overly, I guess, feast or famine-y, overly flippy, I guess is probably the terminology that I'm looking for. I think he's fine. I think the Annie in particular is a champion that's always really worked for him and for Weibo. Tien, Breathe, I think they were also solid here. Tien certainly out jungling Monkey after game number 1, but Monkey looking great in that first game. So for Weibo, I still think they're good. I don't think they're great. I think that they are struggling to compete with the top 4, and I think their back is up against the wall in terms of making worlds, but that's where they've been the past couple of years, and they've consistently been able to figure it out by the end of the year. So we'll see how it ends up going. And for WE, I've really lost all confidence that I have in this roster. Monkey is a fun player that has a lot of highs, but the lows are starting to come out a bit more over the course of summer, very akin to what Milky Way was last year, although I think Monkey has a much better skill set than a player like Milky Way. But outside of that, there is no one on this team that's going to be able to win games. This bot lane has completely regressed. Specifically, Taeyun has completely gone back to what he was for KDF and, for DRX in the Challengers League for a long time, where he is just not a good player. He is dead of the series once again. His positioning is terrible. His damage output is terrible. The way he plays laning phase is terrible. It's not good, man. Like, watching him try to play these games is really frustrating because I think that there are a lot of things he could capitalize on that he just doesn't. And obviously, you're not expecting the world out of Taeyun or anything like that, but you do want to see some level of what he showed in the spring split. That scrim god that everybody talked about for such a long time. I think that has been almost entirely absent from the summer split so far, and he's gone back to being one of the weaker players in the entire league, certainly in Group Ascend. I think that that is a fair thing to say. Cube is just not an LPL caliber top laner right now. He's kind of been hidden, I think, for a majority of the year, but he's not getting hidden any longer. His team fighting is awful. Like, he is good as a weak side laner where he can survive and go down like 10 CS in bad matchups and actually look pretty good in that role. You get him into 5v5, so you get him set up in the late game. He's too far forward. He's going to make a mistake. It's not a good look. Again, Karis and Vampire, I don't think are, great players. Karis is not, good really in any facet of the game. Xiaohu wasn't really, super aggressive in this series, and Karis was still pretty far behind. And Vampire, while I do think he's shown a ton of progression and is likely the second best player on this team right now, he's not going to be able to carry them. Monkey is the only player who can actively win games right now for WE, and if he's not doing it super consistently, this team is absolutely doomed. And even then, like, Monkey is making mental errors in the back half of these games, and so just feels kind of disappointing with where WE are at right now, and Weibo took advantage of that. While I don't think that in their current form they are world beaters, I do believe they can get into the top 4 if they continue their progression. They certainly have the talent to do so. It's all really about whether or not they can unlock it. But that's going to bring us to day number 3, and kicking off day number 3 was a matchup between JD Gaming and Top Esports, where TES once again are going to be Game 3 merchants. They're going to come out on top. They're going to pick up a series win, and people are starting to get sad because I know everyone in the community does not like it when Top Esports proves themselves to be one of the best teams in the entire league, but at this point, there is no denying that Top Esports are favorites right now in the LPL. One of the favorites at the very least, alongside BLG, IG, and Anyone's Legend. Of course, the 4 teams that are kind of the big 4 right now, the 4 teams expected to go to Worlds from the LPL, but JD Gaming very much not a part of that. They had a chance to be able to take Game 3. Shun actually got a ton of gold on the Wukong at the start of game number 3, but boy, did it not matter. Boy, did he not utilize that under any circumstance, and boy, is he playing the worst league he's played all year right now. Really frustrating stuff. We'll go ahead and get into it. Player of the series for me is going to go to 369 on the top lane. Talk about rolling 9s on the day. This was a massive Gnar game in game number 3 from him. Quite frankly, the top gap in this series was always there in favor of TES, even in game number 2, where the Scion just couldn't really do much, but 369 was really good here today, and I think that's kind of an important turning point for Top Esports. He was the best top laner in the world in winter. Like, when you go all the way back to the beginning of the year, that small sample size where, right before first stand, and even at times at first stand, like, he was the top laner that I would take over anybody in terms of where he was at the start of this year. Things were still very good, but not quite as dominant. In the spring split, he wasn't really all that effective in the playoffs once Kanavi's form and Cream's form started to go down, and then obviously, summer comes around and he's kind of a background player to Kanavi and Jackie Love, who have been taking over basically every single game that they play. But if 369 can get back online and start being one of the best top laners in the world again, really be a player that you can count on to take over games, to be weak side and dominate there, to be strong side and dominate there, that's really going to change, I think, the outlook for Top Esports for a lot of teams. So do really want to see that. I want to see 369 continue to grow and evolve and get back into form. Wasn't just him, though. Kanavi continues his 100% win rate on Naafiri, who he pulls out in game number 3. Obviously, I'm not the biggest Naafiri fan at this point in time. I've talked about that pretty extensively on the channel. I think that champion has been nerfed to a point where she's really not super viable anymore, or at least not strong in the same kind of way she was before. But again, if your enemy jungler is just going to give you a bunch of free kills, then yeah, Naafiri all of a sudden becomes very strong. You have a ton of setup on this team with Annie, with Renata, with Gnar, so it's really easy to see a world where the Naafiri ends up getting out of control, and I think that's kind of what happened. I don't think the bot lane were the main characters in this one. I think, Jackie Love and Hong kind of took a back seat here. Jackie Love playing Kalista in game number 3 and not really being able to play the game at all, because look at the range on the side of JDG. It's basically impossible for Kalista to ever do anything in the mid to late game here, but Cream had a couple of nice setups, even if he wasn't necessarily a carry at all. Like I said, Hong wasn't really a huge factor. This was mostly a topside diff for Top Esports. 369 and Kanavi really stepping up. And for JDG on the other side, this is continuing to become a problem for this team where they just can't seem to find their form altogether. Even when some players that you're hoping step up actually do play well, you can't get the entirety of the team to play well at the same time. That's the most frustrating part. Pays and Scout were pretty good in this series. Even Zhuo was fine, I think, all things considered, in this series in comparison to what my expectations were for him. But Shun this time and Xiaoshu, the players who have been the most consistent, arguably, for this JDG team across this year, were the ones to underperform. Shun is going to get done of the series for me. I know it doesn't show up in the KDAs, but not only is he like notoriously bad into Kanavi, it's always been a matchup that we talked about going back to the Invictus days. I remember making a point of that on this channel when I was talking about Shun, where he was just really inconsistent in his matchup against Kanavi, but he got such a huge lead in game number 3 and did literally nothing with it on the Wukong. I get that the game state can be a bit more difficult if the Gnar and the Annie are running around and creating a lot of action, but Shun really didn't do anything to be able to push that tempo back in the favor of JDG, and that is frustrating when your entire team is counting on you. And then on top of that, I don't think the Pantheon in game 1 was nearly as good as the KDA would indicate either, so I don't know, man. Shun, to me, felt like the most negative player for JDG in this series, which is never good. Xiaoshu, like I said, has maybe been the best player on this team across this split. He got blasted by 369. This top lane matchup was not particularly close, but that's what happens, right? You know, when 369 rolls 9s, then it doesn't really matter who's on the other side, especially a player like Xiaoshu that, even if I do like his development, I wouldn't expect to be able to go into this matchup and win. You needed Shun to step up, and he just didn't. JDG clearly feel on the outside. I just talked about Weibo being a team that is clearly in the upper echelon, but maybe like a half step out. JDG are at least a full step out of that upper echelon. They need a ton of things to go right for them to even have a chance against the top tier teams. And even when they do, with Scout playing fine and Pays playing fine and Zhuo playing fine, you can't have a player like Shun or Xiaoshu then underperform. Everyone's got to click, and it just doesn't feel like that's going to happen for JDG. And for Top Esports, again, very nice win. They continue to stay at the top of the standings. There is a very real shot that this is the best team in the LPL. And I know LPL fans don't want to hear that, but right now that might be the truth. Then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and it really is a jam-packed day as we continue in Group Ascend with Anyone's Legend taking on Bilibili Gaming. And Anyone's Legend is going to pick up a very important 2-1 series win, not just for themselves, but for BLG, who officially suffer their first loss of the summer split. This is their first series loss, all split long. The undefeated streak ends up coming to an end here, and it is to the hands of the defending champions and the team that we were hoping and praying would finally get their feet under them, and that's exactly what ended up happening. There are a lot of things to talk about. Game 3 might be the game of the year in terms of just how fun it was to watch. If you haven't seen this game number 3, I'm sorry I already spoiled it for you, but please go ahead and go watch it. It was super fun to watch and really, really fun to talk about. So, you know, I'm really excited to kind of get into it, but there are a lot of takeaways from this series, most notably that I don't think this was a clear-cut, you know, oh, AL is better than BLG. I think BLG had a very real shot of being able to win that game number 3. They made some boneheaded macro decisions, and some of that you can put on Shadow, I'm sure, because he's been heralded as this guy who's come in and become the primary shot caller for BLG, but really they were in a spot where they should have won game number 3, and it should not have been close. The only reason they lost was a couple of bad decisions. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series, there are 2 options, in my opinion, for player of the series. The one I gave it to, which is Hope, if you want to keep it on the winning side. I think Hope was the most important player in Game 3 on the Misfortune in terms of just being able to push the game forward, although I think a lot of that was set up for him, but he was the one that was breaking through BLG and their lack of frontline by the end of the game. Not lack of frontline, I shouldn't say that because Bin was huge, but, you know, Hope was the one kind of, you know, plowing through, I would say, and really carrying in the back half. Or you just give player of the series to Bin. I think it's honestly super justifiable to give player of the series to Bin. Even though he lost the series, he was probably the best player on the Rift here today. It just didn't end up mattering. He was like 10-0 or 10-1 and, you know, 15 or whatever on Ornn in game number 3. Absolutely absurd. If he had had a better game number 2 on the Yorick, I would have considered giving it to him because he was great in game 1 and he really was phenomenal in game number 3, but I ended up leaning on Hope. I think at this point I owe Hope a player of the series just for all the times I've said, well, you know, you could give it to Hope, but I'm not going to. I think at some point I do have to give him at least some props for the way he's been playing over the course of this year, and this is the time. While I don't know if I believe in Hope as like a top tier AD carry moving forward, his production this year is completely undeniable. I think in this system, in the way that AL is set up, Hope has arguably been the most productive AD carry in the LPL, and so Happy to finally give him his due and give him a player of the series, especially for that misfortune game in game 3. Worth noting, he was great on the Sivir in game 2 as well, and I think that also really helped my decision. I think that there were a couple of other things that ended up going really positive for AL. Shanks was really good in game 2 on the Orianna, even if I needed to see more on the Azir. I think Tarzan ended up being better than Shadow down the stretch, even if Tarzan continues to have some up and down moments that I need to see more of. He really has not been playing Tarzan-esque over the course of this summer split so far in comparison to what we saw. KL was at times good, at times bad, we'll just say, in the support position. That's kind of how it is when you play Alistair and Leona and Nico and a lot of these champions that need to go in and need to make plays in order to stay relevant. The only negative I'll give AL is they certainly had the worst top laner in this series. Flandra definitely typing top gap at the end of this because he got massacred by Bin in terms of how this matchup went, and I think if you wanted to give dud of the series to Flandra, that's also fair. If you really wanted to give player of the series to Bin and dud of the series to Flandra and just say, like, whatever, who cares that AL won, I'm really not going to be all that upset by that decision in terms of how things ended up breaking down. I genuinely think they were the best and worst player on the Rift, respectively. I just couldn't really commit myself to doing that. It would go against a lot of the, I guess, past examples that I've set on this channel, and I don't necessarily want to do that. But, you know, for AL, I think they're going to feel pretty lucky to walk out of this with a win. I think that there were many moments in game 3 that they probably shouldn't have won, and yet they did anyways. So congratulations to them. Maybe this is the jumpstart they needed in order to get going. This doesn't really change my opinion on them all that much because they probably shouldn't have won this anyways, but it is what it is. For BLG on the other side, they were so close to being able to pick up this win and really cement themselves as the #1 team in the LPL. They just couldn't quite get the job done, and you kind of got to point the finger at least a little bit at Shadow in the jungle, who is going to get dud of the series. Obviously, the shot calling and the macro decisions at the end of game 3 end up really coming back to bite them in terms of the things that they wanted to trade on the map, but the Nocturne as well became entirely useless by the end of this game. Really, the whole point of the Nocturne, the later and later you get, is to set up for Yunara to be able to carry. Elk also played quite poor, in my opinion, at the end of this game, and I'm going to be honest, there are a lot of Elk defenders. This is not a series that I think you can look at and be like, oh, you know, here's Elk, like, the KDA looks really good. Like, I'm sorry, it's just not there in terms of tape right now, and I think that even goes for the Yunara game, and, you know, for Lucian, like, he's part of the reason why they ended up losing this series, but at the end of the day, Shadow was the one who needed to step up and was the least impactful player on BLG in game number 3, so he's the one who gets dud of the series. Like I said, if you wanted to give dud of the series to Flandra, if you wanted to give player of the series to Bin, I'm not going to be mad at you, but Bin definitely deserves a shout out. If that Yorick game in game 2 was just slightly better, then he probably would get player of the series for those 2 awesome games, but it is what it is. It doesn't matter how strong you are on Ornn, it's really hard to 1v9 the game. On, I thought, had a couple of really creative engages, and Knight was generally very good in this series. Maybe not fantastic, but very, very good, and BLG just didn't have the firepower to overcome AL. It really just came down to a couple of decisions at the end of the game that they made wrong, and that kind of cost them everything. I'm not going to sit here and lambast BLG. I think there's a real shot they still are the best team in the LPL. I don't think this really changes my thoughts on either of these two teams all that much, because I think you can make the argument that BLG was better than AL here today, and in fact, I think I would maybe even make that argument. So it is what it is. BLG lose their undefeated streak, but definitely still have a lot going for them. AL might need this kind of win to get their confidence back under them, but still need to prove a lot more to me. Either way, it was really fun to see these two teams go head-to-head. Then moving on to day number 4, our middle day here in the LPL in week number 5, and we kicked off day 4 with a matchup that is super important for Group Nirvana. It's Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on Edward Gaming, and NIP pick up the 2-1 series win. This is massive for them, not because I think it really changes the standings all that much, but because we just saw the 2 undefeated teams in the LPL lose games back-to-back in BLG and EDG in terms of their series. So no more undefeated teams in terms of the LPL, but still a lot to take away from this series in particular. I think everybody had just been writing off everyone else in Group Nirvana outside of Edward Gaming from making the playoffs, but honestly, what this proves to me is not that EDG is bad, but rather that both of these teams might actually be kind of good. I think the level of play is still leaving a lot to be desired, but that's certainly the case at the bottom of Group Ascend as well. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the series has to go to Nayo in the jungle. This guy is tearing it up right now in Group Nirvana. No doubt he is the Group Nirvana MVP. Like, it's not even close right now in terms of just how much he's pushing his team forward. If I were willing to give MVP to a Group Nirvana player, he's probably the most valuable player to his own individual team in the entire league right now, just in terms of where NIP are at and where I think they would be at if they didn't have him on the team. If it was just Aki and PP God previously starting for NIP, how different I think this roster would look and how different I think they would play. Nayo has come in and completely revitalized everything that NIP are doing. And he just did it against the best jungler in Group Nirvana, in Xiaohao on the other side. Trust me, I'm the biggest Xiaohao defender in the world, but Nio has been better so far this split, especially across this week, and I think this really ends up proving it. I'm all in on the Nio train right now. This guy was the LDL MVP for a reason when he came up with Rare Atom. I thought that they would get top 10 purely based off the fact that I thought Nio was that good in the jungle position. It obviously didn't work out like that, but this guy's crazy. You give him a situation where he's going to be able to carry. I actually do think he could be a real difference maker at this level. Again, he's only played against bad junglers regularly, but this is an example of him playing a jungler that I really do believe is good, and he still outplayed him. I really think Nio is in a great spot to be able to grow as a player, and I think you can build around him as a potential jungler of the future. It's not just him, though. Solo kill continues to look much better on the top side. The second half of the split for him has been better than the first, and I think that's a really good thing to be able to say. That was kind of the case for him last split as well. Obviously, he didn't play really a lot of the first half with Shanji still starting there in the top lane, but I think Solo Kill's really figured things out and come back along. ZDZ is just not a great player. He can have great moments and he can have great, a series here or there that he's going to play well in, but Solo Kill generally should be the better of these two top laners, and he was in this series. Doingbi was very good. Leave and Niket were fine. I certainly don't think they were the problem on this team, but they took more of a backseat role. Once again, that's kind of been their role so far in the summer split, and it's working out right now for NIP. Honestly, I'm just really liking where this team is at, and there's an argument that they are the more dangerous team between them and EDG because of the upside of Nio and Doingbi in the middle of the map. But for EDG, as much as I'd love to sit here and say that, oh, they're doomed, they're dead in the water now, this kind of proves that they're not going to be a playoff team, I think it's pretty reasonable to just take one loss and say, all right, you're going to be fine moving forward. I think that there were some positives. I still think Angel is playing quite well in the mid lane. Angel had a lot of room to operate because Doingbi was playing mostly for the rest of the map, but he still played really well. I would say throughout a lot of this series, Palkia is so aggressive, and when that works, it works. When it doesn't work, it looks terrible in the support position, but I'm not going to sit here and say that he's doomed or anything like that. I am concerned about a couple of players, though. On kind of being chief among them right now. On and ZDZ are the two players that I just don't really know if I believe in right now. For EDG, On continues to underperform in these big moments. His positioning on his signature Draven in game number 3 was just not good enough. He was a big reason why they ended up losing that game, because he got targeted and couldn't really do anything about it. Quite frankly, he wasn't very good in game 2 on the Corki either. I need to see a ton more out of On. He's just not been the player that he was the past couple of years so far in 2025, and I think he could potentially hold this team back. ZDZ, like I said, is the other piece. I think he's had good moments this split, but a lot of the good moments kind of come from the fact that I think this team is just generally really good and has a ton of opportunities for somebody to be able to express their mechanical skill on the top side. Xiaohao ended up getting out jungled here, and I am going to criticize him because I don't think he played well, but he's been so good for this team throughout the rest of the split that I am going to give him a bit of a pass. And again, if you're going to give Palkia a pass, you kind of have to give Xiaohao a pass in terms of how things are going, but it's certainly a frustrating loss for EDG. That being said, it likely won't mean all that much in terms of the standings because, like I said, this is the last time these two teams end up meeting in the regular season. It is very likely this is EDG's only loss going into the play-in stage, and if that is the case, then they're still the number 1 seed. They're still going to have a better record, even with NIP taking this. But what this does prove is that NIP is a dangerous team that has to be watched out for, and that they have a real shot of making playoffs. Then moving on to our second series of day number 4, and our second series was a bottom clash in Group Ascend. It was WE taking on FunPlus Phoenix, and WE is once again going to be able to pick up a very important victory here. They need to consistently be able to beat FPX. That has to be the case. They have to show that they are a top 8 team by proving that they can at the very least hang with the bottom tier teams or be better than the bottom tier teams, because the question right now is not can WE compete to actually do something in the playoffs. I think at this point the ship has kind of sailed on WE's hype train on what they can be moving forward, but I think at this point, when you look at WE, they have to be a playoff team. They have to be top 8. They have to beat whoever comes out of Group Nirvana to play them in the play-in stage, whether that be Ninjas in Pyjamas or Edward Gaming, likely again Ninjas in Pyjamas. They have to be good enough to be able to beat that team to get into the playoffs, because missing out on it entirely would be an absolute disaster for this team. This is the sign that they are still good enough to be able to get into that top 8 and that they are going to be better than whoever comes through that system. But for FPX on the other side, this team is not looking like a playoff team. I think that they likely would be you know, not even top 2 in Group Nirvana right now. I genuinely think that's where they're at. They might not even be top 3 in terms of how things are breaking down, although that I think is a little bit more tenuous in terms of, you know, where the drop-off ends up coming in. But this FPX team is bad. They are bad in a lot of different ways, and I'm happy to go over it. We'll start for WE. Credit to their resilience. This is not an easy series to win. I think you can look at the scoreboard and see, you know, a lot of positives for WE, but overall, this was one that was a lot more tenuous, especially game 2. They were down a ton of gold early on at the beginning of game 2. They kept their wits about them, and they played through Taeyun's Kai'Sa, and eventually they were able to come out on top. I really criticized Taeyun earlier on in the week. He's going to get player of the series this time. In this series, this is the showing that he needed to showcase, where it's like, okay, you can still be functional in the LPL. Maybe you're just not good enough to be able to compete near the top. Maybe you're going to be worse against a lot of the other, like, actually competitive, like, top 6-ish-esque teams. But if you're going to consistently be able to beat top 10-ish teams, that's an okay place for Taeyun to sit, I think, as an AD carry. I think he can just be incredibly inconsistent. His bad games just look so bad, especially in comparison to a lot of other AD carries. I would typically say that he's worse than Jhachi on the other side of this, but he quite frankly wasn't in this series. Jhachi made a ton of mistakes in game number 1 on the Zeri that Taeyun took advantage of, and then even with FPX getting that lead at the beginning of game 2, Taeyun stayed neutral basically throughout the entirety of the early laning phase and then took over in the back half of the game. This was really great stuff, being able to play through your hyper carry ADC, and it looked really good. I think Vampire deserves a lot of credit for that Nico game as well. He's going to get a lot of people's player of the game because of that, like, flashy Nico ultimate, and just everything that ends up going on around Nico. I think he was much more of a highlight player than he was like an effective player, but that's not to say that he wasn't effective, just that, you know, I don't think he was quite player of the game worthy in terms of game number 2. I think the Kai'Sa was what ended up really breaking the game open, and Taeyun's ability to generate resources was really the biggest reason for that. But Vampire still had to set things up for him, and I think he was better than Jue once again in this series. Monkey continues to look really good. Really, it's just about the consistency with him, man. It's not the good games, it's the bad games that you get worried about. Karis, Cube, they were fine. Cube was weak side, thank God, throughout this entire series. That's where he thrives, as long as he can get into the late game relatively neutral. Hopefully you can play around someone else, and then Karis was honestly better than Care in this series. Care has been a nightmare over the course of the summer split. I think a lot of us could have seen that coming, but Karis was likely considered the worst mid laner in this group of Sem. Maybe not so much anymore in terms of how things are breaking down. So again, nice win for WE. They needed to be able to pick it up to prove that they could be better than, like, the mediocre teams here in the LPL, and that's exactly what FPX is. They're a team that's a lot closer to being LGD than they are to being JD Gaming, which I think is really frustrating, I think, for a lot of people in terms of just what the expectation for them was. But I had them, I think, number 13 or something in my power rankings going into this split. Yes, I didn't think they would have Jue, and yes, I didn't think they would have a jungler, which they don't, and they have IYY, who's basically never played competitive before this split, but they've been better than that. I think it's fair to say that they are not quite one of the bottom, you know, 1 or 2 teams in the entire league, but they are also getting worse, which I think is a concerning trait, and they got a giant lead in game 2 that they almost immediately threw with really bad macro. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Jhachi in the bot lane here, mostly for game 1. I actually don't really think he was all that bad in game 2. Maybe he could have done a bit more on the Jhin, but I think at that point you're kind of nitpicking. I think this is mostly for the Zeri game where he was just out of position and constantly being capitalized on. That game was much more in WE's control from start to finish, and I think that is a good sign of just where WE can be at. But Jhachi did not have a very good week, all things considered. He was pretty good for this team. In fact, I would say he was quite good for them at the beginning of the split. We'll see how that carries on. It seems like as the team has gotten worse, this bot lane has reduced in effectiveness. Not that that should be entirely surprising, but Milky Way's inclusion seems to have completely thrown the bot lane off of their course. Jue is a part of that as well. He's not been nearly as good over the second half of this split. A lot easier to excuse a support for not playing well than an AD carry for not playing well in a bad circumstance, but certainly something that's worth noting. IYY is not a good jungler, despite what, you know, Milky Way was doing for this team. It's not like IYY is going to come in and completely save them. Care is a terrible mid laner. This guy does absolutely nothing. Do not give him Yone. Don't give him a champion that has to be proactive. Don't play a game around him. That's terrifying. It's not going to work out. Care was not good here at all. Sheer was the only player even doing anything. And honestly, this is one of the few times this split where he actually has been productive. Most of this split has not been very good from Sheer. And so for FPX, it's honestly not looking good. Like, I don't really know what else to say. They don't look like a playoff team. They don't look like they're close to being a playoff team. I think that they are closer, like I said, to being LGD than to being like a JDG or even a WE. At this point, they couldn't even take a game off of them in this series. It does feel like they're getting worse. It's all just crumbling around both on and off the Rift for this org. And for WE, they needed this win, and I'm glad they got it, but I don't expect too much of them outside of this for the rest of the split. It's just nice to be able to solidify this and potentially have it in your back pocket going into the playing stage. But then moving on now to day number 5 and kicking off day 5, another huge matchup that has real implications. Anyone's Legend taking on Invictus Gaming, where Anyone's Legend is going to pick up the 2-0 victory. They're really going to dominate IG in terms of how this series goes. It really wasn't all that close between these two teams. AL was absolutely better between the two of them, which I think does come as a shock to a lot of people. I don't think we were looking at AL as being this much better than IG, but as we know, IG can underperform on any given day, and AL are certainly good enough to take advantage of that on any given day. I think the draft in game 2 very much doesn't help. You have so much setup for absolutely no damage coming in. It's going to be very difficult to play it out, and I think they ended up running into a problem where they just couldn't push the game forward, and that led to AL being able to pick up the victory. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Kyle is going to get player of the series. Kyle, KL, let me know what you guys prefer down in the comments. I've heard it from both in terms of just how people pronounce it. I'm going to say Kyle. I think that that's more fun to say. I've not been saying that on the channel, but again, I just think it sounds a little bit better, so Kyle it ends up being. I think the Bard game in game 2 is really the one that ends up standing out for a lot of people. I think the setup in that game was tremendous, but the Alistair was still great in game 1. I think he just had a great performance, and I think mostly for me, it's the support gap that ended up really shining and standing out in terms of these two teams, and so it felt worthwhile to give Kyle player of the series here. I think you could reasonably give it to Tarzan as well in the jungle, who definitely outplayed Wei in terms of the setup this series, but I think Kyle was just much flashier, and I think that is a tiebreaker for me in terms of how things end up breaking down. So again, Kyle looking excellent. I've never really doubted him. He's the one player on this team that I think has looked good even throughout a lot of their slump. I think Hope is the other player who's genuinely just looked good throughout a lot of their slump, but you know, a lot of that is being set up by Kyle. So you don't want to give Hope too much credit with how good of a support he ends up having down in the bot lane. But again, huge support gap in this series, and I think that really went in favor of AL. Hope was also very good at being able to follow up on a lot of the things that were created. It's all well and good to have a Poppy and a Galio and a Bard in terms of all of this, but if your Corki is not doing damage, then you run into the same problem that Invictus has on the other side, which is all of this setup with absolutely no follow-through. Luckily, Hope was very good in this series. Gala couldn't really get any damage off, and the range from Corki ended up really helping him as this game continued onwards. Tarzan, like I said, was fantastic, especially on the Pantheon, I would say. In game number 1, that was really the game that I thought he took over. Why are we allowing Tarzan to have Pantheon? How is that even something that happens in the LPL at this point? Genuinely insane to me, but if there's any way for Tarzan to get back into form, it's giving him some of the best champions in the game in Pantheon and Poppy, and champions that he's very comfortable on, and just kind of letting him run the map. It's obviously not an ideal set of circumstances for IG, but certainly something that they had to give over. Flandra only had 1 death, even if he wasn't super involved in everything. Shanks was really good as a facilitator throughout this series and a secondary carry in terms of the damage that was coming out. AL just looked really clean and really complete as a team. This is their best win in months, and I think if there was ever a glimpse of AL being the team that we thought they were going to be, this is it. Perhaps the BLG series really did fix their mental after all, and then for IG on the other side, boy, was this not good. I know we can expect IG to just randomly play terrible on any given day, but this was a really bad example of what IG can look like at the top end level. Mako ended up really shit this series. Like, I'm going to be entirely honest, man. He was completely useless for IG. He's going to get done of the series here. I don't even think it's entirely his fault, but we can quickly talk about the game 2 draft. Really difficult to ever break through Sion, Galio, and Poppy, I guess, when your only form of damage is Ezreal. Like, your secondary damage dealer in this comp is Ambessa. That is a terrible place to be in terms of where this draft ends up landing. I think the Annie-Vi combo just doesn't make any sense. These are both champions that want to set up for other champions, and if nobody's going to be able to follow through, then I just don't think it ends up working out. Mako on the Nico ended up not really doing anything, and boy, was his positioning bad down the stretch. That champion is so squishy. If you get caught out, you are doomed. But I think it's reasonable to give dud of the series to Wei as well in the jungle. I just don't really think he played all that bad. I just think it was really difficult for him to be effective on the Vi in game 2. I think he was okay on the Skarner in game 1, even if he was out jungled by Tarzan, but the Vi, like, it didn't work really at any point. Part of that is the construction of the team, part of that is the game state that they found themselves in, but, you know, Wei just wasn't very effective here. I think Rookie was worse than Shanks. I think the Shy was worse than Flandra. The only player who wasn't making egregious mistakes was Gala, and that's because he wasn't doing anything in this game. So really not a good look for IG, probably one of their weaker looks of the entire split. You know, we expected this team to lose to AL. I think I still had AL as favorites coming into this series, but I wanted to see IG put up at least a little bit of a fight like they normally do against top teams. That just didn't happen here. AL ran away with this series. It wasn't particularly close, and you do have to give them all the credit in the world because it really does feel like they are rebuilding themselves one step at a time right now. Then moving on now to our second series of day number 5 and another group ascend matchup as we see Weibo Gaming taking on Bilibili Gaming, and BLG get their win back after dropping earlier in the week to Anyone's Legend. They end up stabilizing and picking up a win here against Weibo, but this one was also quite contentious. There were moments where it felt like Weibo actually had a chance back into game number 3. Leave it to Shadow, though, to snuff out the light from Weibo Gaming. Big props on the call for that one, because that is phenomenal. But overall, very good stuff from BLG. They end up walking away with the win, and quite frankly, they were the better team here today. I don't want to sit here and say that, oh, Weibo Gaming, put up a good fight and they deserve to be, considered in the upper echelon. I think that is fair, and I think there are some positives to take away in that direction, but really, BLG were still better here today, and I think it's fair to talk about them as such. I think people are going to walk out of this week with a more negative opinion of BLG than maybe I'm willing to give, at least through these 2 games. We'll talk about the final 2 days when we get to them, but through these 2 series, I think BLG has been just fine. They've been about the same level that they've been throughout the rest of the split in terms of their victories, and I think a lot of what ends up coming back to really push BLG forward is just how well Elk played in game 3. He's going to get player of the series here. I think it is kind of up for debate in the sense that Shadow also was super influential throughout whether or not BLG ended up winning this. Like, the good plays were so big for BLG against stealing the Otacon was so massive for them, but the bad plays were definitely still there. Shadow had a couple of moments, especially earlier on in the game, where TN was just able to out-tempo him. But at the end of the day, Elk was the one who had the gold to be able to carry things through to the finish line, and that's what ended up happening. This Jhin game was monstrous from Elk in game number 3. He absolutely decimated Weibo on that pick, and this is really the Elk that we've been waiting for. I think this is easily his best series of the split up until this point, and I'm hopeful that it's going to be able to stick because we know what Elk can look like at his best. Last year, he was the best AD carry in the world. I will argue with a wall on that if I have to. Like, you know what I mean? It just is what it is, but like, it just has not been the same, I would say, over the course of 2025. He's still been very good. I'm not trying to say he's been bad. It's just not felt like he's been number 1 in the LPL. I think he has the talent to be able to get back there. I just need to see it be there a bit more consistently. On was really good in this series. I don't think his KDA is going to showcase that because he was very greedy and aggressive, but specifically, you get this guy on the playmakers, you get him on Nico, you get him on Blitzcrank, his signature champion in game number 3, and things look a lot better for him individually, which is always a really good sign overall. So the bot lane really stepping up for BLG. I already talked a bit about Shadow. Been not quite as effective as he was earlier in the week against Anyone's Legend, but still the better top laner of these 2, which I think is important. And Knight, obviously very good as well. A lot more contained than I think what Xiaohu was on the other side of this matchup, even if both of them had their positives and negatives throughout this series. So for BLG, honestly, I feel pretty good about them coming out of these 2 series. They'll still have one more to talk about later on in the week, at the end of the week, but for now, BLG honestly looking pretty good. I think everything I expected from them in this week ended up coming to fruition, even if the results don't necessarily say that. And for Weibo on the other side, this is a good team. They just are missing a few bits and pieces. Like I talked about, it's really tough to imagine these teams that are outside of the top 4, even teams like IG that are in the top 4, to imagine that every single player on these teams plays well every single series. It's just kind of the way it goes right now in the LPL, and that really is the case for Weibo, because the one player I'm completely buying out on is Light in the bot lane. I'm starting to get to the end of my rope when it comes to Light, because I just don't see it anymore, man. Like, the bad plays are so egregious, his positioning is so bad, his lack of damage is so apparent that it's becoming a really big problem for Weibo. Like, they're not able to consistently win games with Light down in the bot lane because he's just not playing up to tempo. He needs to be better. There is nothing else left to say when it comes to him individually as a player. If he's going to play like this, it's going to continue to be a big issue for Weibo, and it's going to hold them back from being top 4. We know he can get there. This is a guy who's made world finals before, but right now, the play is very substandard, and I think that is not good. I think Crisp was, less good than he was earlier on in the week. I still think he made a couple of big plays, especially on the Alistair in game number 1, but I think for the most part, bot lane ended up just kind of getting outplayed. BLG's bot lane was definitely better in this series. Xiaohu was pretty good. Again, very greedy, very aggressive, often willing to trade his life and risk everything for major plays. Sometimes that worked and sometimes it really didn't, but at the end of the day, at least he was going for something aggressive. It felt like this team was too passive for a lot of this series. Breathe and TN were generally fine. TN had better early games than he did late games, and again, he needed to land that smite on Otacon, which he just wasn't able to do, but, Weibo, I think, at least contested BLG. They looked competent in this series, which is good enough, but I'm not going to panic for BLG. I think this week generally has been fine for them so far, and we'll see if that carries through to the end. But then moving on now to day at number 6. As you guys know by now, the start of our weekend means our Super Day coming in, 3 series to cover, and kicking off day number 6 was a matchup between JD Gaming and Team WE, where JD Gaming are going to pick up the 2-1 series win. At this point, what do I even say about series like this, where WE ends up winning game 1 and losing the other 2 games, where JDG beats a team that's outside of the top 6, but they can't compete, quite frankly, with the teams in the upper echelon. Like, every narrative that we have pushed for either of these 2 teams is being expounded by this performance. There's honestly not a lot that I can give you that's going to change your mind in any real way in terms of how this went. I might even keep it quite short because of that, because there really just, again, isn't a lot to actually analyze in terms of how this goes down. The one major thing that I think there is to take away from a series like this is that Xiaoshu is legit. He is genuinely a very good top laner, and he's performing very well right now. He's going to get player of the series on the top side almost entirely for that Renekton game in game number 3. He was good throughout the rest of the series, but I think this game in particular really helped elevate him over not only Q, but everybody else on WE in terms of how much he was able to kind of break through. I think everybody else on the team was pretty solid throughout this series. We'll get into them, but again, if Xiaoshu's actually going to be a good top laner, which isn't out of the realm of possibility, I want to make that abundantly clear as well. This is a player that I had been hyping up after his rookie split in, I want to say 2022 summer, maybe it was 2023 spring, one of those years on LGD where he had that rookie split, was almost immediately bought by Rare Adam to become their starting top laner. He's kind of, moved around in terms of the LPL because a lot of the teams he was on just weren't very good, and so he's kind of been shopped left and right to become a potential breakthrough prospect. And I had started to give up on him, especially at the beginning of this year when it felt like he was given more of a responsibility on RNG to be relevant, and he wasn't necessarily living up to that. However, right now it's finally coming to fruition on JD Gaming. Let it be known that he finally gets on a good team and starts playing like one of the better top laners in the league. I'm not quite sure this is entirely sustainable, but at least for now, this looks like a big upgrade over Alla, who was on this team in the spring split and was not very good for them. And I think he could be somebody that they actually might want to build around moving into the future. I said that about Sheer last year as well, though, so who really knows when it comes to this organization. But everybody else is fine. I would say Pays had a pretty decent series, was too far forward in their losses in game 1, or I guess their loss in game 1 on the Kai'Sa, but was pretty good on the Varus and the Lucian. Scout and Shun, I think, were much better than they were earlier in the week. Shun, in particular, gets his, or I guess one of his signature picks in the Kindred alongside the Nidalee, and ends up looking very good on that, especially after that first game. Monkey, once again, being a game 1 merchant on the Skarner, and then not having the same kind of impact because he's playing way too aggressively on things like Xin Zhao and Nocturne. The only negative I can give is that Zhuo has not played that well, I would say, so far on JDG, or maybe I'm just predispositioned to say that because honestly his performances have really not been that terrible, but I just don't expect him to continue to be positive for this team moving forward. But Xiaoshu definitely looks good. Pays had a good week, all things considered. If Shun and Scout are going to be fine, JDG can consistently be the 6th best team in the LPL, but right now it still does feel like that is their ceiling. And for WE on the other side, really, like, again, this is the team where it's even harder to try to find a narrative that I can give you that I haven't repeated over and over and over again up until this point already, because, Vampire's dead of the series, and that's maybe the new thing here, is that Vampire's been pretty good for this team. He's probably been the 2nd best player on the team throughout this split behind Monkey, but he wasn't very good in this series. Okay, it's fine. He's playing super aggressive engagers, and the team really didn't have control. I'm not going to blame him all that much, but, like, with the rest of this, right, you've got Taeyun playing generally fine, but making a couple of big mistakes. Monkey looking great in game 1, but not being able to keep that form up. You have Cube looking completely outclassed on the top side. Karis not really having enough pressure and not being aggressive enough to translate his early leads into anything. There's nothing different about this WE from anything we've seen from them in the past, and I think that is the most concerning part. So overall, there's nothing to say. WE are game 1 merchants, and they get worse as Fearless goes along. They start to lose a lot of that pressure in the early game, and their lack of talent ends up coming back to bite them. And JDG is better than the bad teams in Group Ascend, but they're not as good as the good teams in Group Ascend. It's about as cookie cutter of a result as we could have expected. But then moving on to our second series of day number 6, and our second series is one that really does matter for Group Nirvana. It's Ultra Prime taking on Thunder Talk Gaming, and Ultra Prime are going to pick up the 2-1 series win. These are the two teams that really are fighting it out to be top 12 right now in the LPL, to get that 4th and final spot in the play-ins from Group Nirvana. And with Ultra Prime picking up this win, they're in a much better spot to actually be able to do that than Thunder Talk is, who really is on the outside looking in right now. If there was ever a time to to panic for Thunder Talk fans, if there are any, now is definitely the time to do so, because this team is falling apart. They are significantly worse than they were at any point in the year, especially before they lost Beichuan. But now, like, honestly, this might be the worst version of this team they've been all year long, even with Aki coming in to the jungle. And maybe it's because of Aki coming into the jungle. You never really want to, say that in a positive or negative light. So we'll talk about it here. But for Ultra Prime, starting with the winning side, as we always do, player of the series for me, pretty obviously is going to go to Jung. I thought he was the most consistent player on the Rift across every single game here today, specifically their wins, the Scion and then the Cassante. This guy's really good on the Mbessa Cassante types of champions, the pseudo tanks that are also major damage dealers in the later part of the game. He's just really comfortable in that mold, and I think it's very clear that everybody who goes up against Hoya is going to have the best game that they've played the entire season long. Like, just is what it is. Hoya is not a player that is really standing up to anybody right now in terms of his performances, but Jung has honestly been on a bit of a hot streak over the course of this split. I know I talked a bit down at him in the first series, and I think rightfully so. We haven't necessarily seen the same kind of upside that maybe we were looking for. I was really high on him coming into the year, coming off of his 2024 on Frank. I really thought he was going to be a big difference maker at this level. It's not necessarily been the case, but I think if there was ever, a time for him to figure it out, it's been the past couple of weeks where he really has felt a lot more comfortable, and he started to play a lot better. His summer has been better than his spring, which was better than his winter, which I think is always a good sign. So hopefully Jung can continue to improve, because he's pretty fun to watch. Xiaoxia is the other player that I think you point out in a positive light here. You could argue he was even the best player on the Rift in Game 3, in particular on the Rakan. Really nice stuff from him. I've been very critical of Xiaoxia over the course of this split and this year in general. I think he's been worse in summer than he was in spring, but I think there are moments in there that let you see what Ultra Prime sees. I just am a bit concerned about what the upside looks like for a player that is this feast or famine. His bad games are so bad. Like, genuinely, it is very difficult to imagine a world where he ever becomes a consistent player because of just how poorly he plays when his team doesn't have tempo and pressure in a couple of key areas. But at least for now, when he does get that tempo and pressure, when he can play on the front foot, he ends up looking really good in those circumstances. Saber's KDA is probably a bit better than maybe his gameplay would indicate, but he also was going into Saytab, who's unplayable right now. Junhao was good, better than Aki. Baya was fine, not as good as 1xN, but that had less to do with Baya and more to do with 1xN. Overall, for Ultra Prime, it's a really, really necessary win, a huge one, quite frankly, for their playing qualification. And for Thunder Talk, this is a disastrous loss. You could not afford to lose this series, and yet here we are. They lost this series. It's a really bad place for them to be right now, and I think you can look at a couple of key areas. I think the jungle has not been good for them ever since Beichuan left, and now that Beichuan's not even starting, honestly, like, what does Thunder Talk have to do to get him back in terms of just, fixing this team's season? Because I'm pretty sure he would right the ship, but Aki has not been able to salvage what Xiao Huangren was not able to pick up either in the jungle. Everything's kind of been a disaster there. Top lane is a nightmare for this team, arguably the worst in the entire league. But most importantly for me, when you don't have a good mid laner, it's really hard to win at this level. We talked about, Xiao Qinghua, and then also, of course, Haichao really struggling in the mid lane for those bottom two teams. Saytab might be the worst mid laner in the LPL. He's right in there as a consideration for that award, which is never a good place to be. Saytab has completely fallen off from what he was at the beginning of the year. As it turns out, it was just a mirage that this guy figured things out. In the LPL, his bad games in the LCK were actually real, and unfortunately, this is just who he's going to be. I think he's going to be somebody who's not very good at getting resources and cannot play without them, which is really a bad combination of things. When Saber is completely outperforming you on the other side in terms of the 1v1, things are going quite poorly for Saytab, so that's not good. I think Feather really underperformed here. Again, I already talked a bit, but Aki's not been good. Hoya's been terrible for this team. 1xN is trapped. Like, he genuinely continues to play very well. I would argue this is his best split ever, and I know that's a crazy thing to say because people have always been a bit higher on 1xN than maybe I have been, but I really do think I've seen more this split than I ever have before, which is a good sign for 1xN, who I think continues to get better. Do I think this guy is ever going to become that elite AD carry that everyone wants him to be? I don't think so. I would still bet against it. I think it's possible. I think he has the mechanical ceiling, but he's also playing Smolder and, getting a ton of resources, and so maybe it's just circumstantial. Like, I don't want to sit here and overreact or underreact or do anything about that. 1xN continues to play well, and the rest of his team continues to be bad. Maybe one day the rest of his team can be good, and then we can properly evaluate just how good 1xN is as a player, but right now that is just not the case. Thunder Talk are not competitive. They are not a fun team to watch, and right now they're on the outside looking in alongside LNG. This is worst case scenario for Thunder Talk. They need to figure it out now, and for Ultra Prime, their destiny is in their own hands. This is a team and an org that has constantly thrown their opportunity to make play-ins or playoffs over and over and over again over the course of their history. This is the first time where it really does feel like they're living up to their own potential. Hopefully they can keep it up. Then moving on to our third and final series of day number 6, and this one was really an interesting one to go ahead and talk about. It was Invictus Gaming taking on Top Esports, and Invictus Gaming is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. Boy, did I not expect this result with how things were going, but honestly, that's the point where IG always end up, exceeding or underperforming your expectations. There is no middle ground in terms of how this ends up going. IG are either going to be the team that ends up completely running every single thing that they are a part of, or, completely bottoming out against teams that they have no business losing against. They lose to FPX, they beat Top Esports. That's the IG way, and it continues here, I guess, in this series where they just outplay Top Esports when it matters the most. Game 2, Game 3, they were better, and it's not really all that disputable. I think Kanavi and Jackie Love actually did step up and perform here today, and you could argue that, Kanavi was the better jungler, or that Jackie Love, continued to be really effective down in the bot lane. Even Hong was decently good, if not slightly invisible for the team, but the solo lane gap for IG was simply too large. And if 2018 Invictus Gaming fans aren't celebrating and cheering from the rooftops right now, then I don't know what is going on, because it was the Shy and Rookie. They were the diff in this series. Really fun to watch. Rookie's going to be the player who ends up getting player of the series for me. This guy's sneakily on an MVP type of pace right now in the mid lane. He really has been that important for IG. I was not on the Rookie hype train at the beginning of the year. In fact, I thought he was overhyped coming out of the spring split. I did not think he was nearly as good as a lot of the other analysts or other pundits or figures in the LPL community would make him out to be. I did not even consider him for an all-pro team. I did not think he was close to being a top 3 or 4 mid laner in the LPL. But that's all changing this split. Right now, he is incredible. He is really dominating the Group Ascend competition that he's going up against. He's really, taking it to a lot of the other top-tier mid laners that are playing right now in Group Ascend. And we've been waiting for someone to really emerge in the mid lane in particular, because there really have not been a lot of consistently good players throughout the mid lane position in the LPL this year. Shanks has really taken that role as the number 2 mid laner because the rest of his team is really good. Do I think that Shanks has, fully cemented himself as a top 2 mid laner? No, I think that could easily be overthrown, but who was competing with him? Cream, Xiaohu, those were the other players that were actively putting up seasons that could compete with Shanks, and so to have someone else in the discussion that can finally start to potentially fight for a top 3 spot, it's been sorely needed, and Rookie is fully grasping it because he was so much better than Cream in this series. It wasn't particularly close, and he's been better than almost everybody that he's gone up against throughout this split, so I'm feeling pretty good about Rookie, if you can't tell. I thought his Annie and his Galio both looked excellent, but how can you not talk about the Shy as well? You can talk about his terrible mid games, and I'll agree with you. These mid games are not good, but his laning phase, pretty strong as long as you can keep him isolated in the 1v1. And his late games, his team fighting, it's been massive for this team. They have become true must-watch kind of games for him. Ornn is very sneakily his best champion right now in terms of just how he plays the game, the impact that he can have with that ultimate in the back half. He lands some massive Ornn horns throughout the back end of this series, and he's done this before. This is not even the first time this split where he's been capable of doing that. He completely gapped 369 in terms of their lane and just generating resources, and then had more of an impact than him in team fights as well. The Shy is performing once again like a top-tier top laner. Who knows how long that'll last, especially domestically, but at least for now we enjoy it while we can. Gala was really solid here. I would argue that he was better than Jackie Lev, even if it was only marginally. Mako was pretty solid, certainly better than earlier in the week. I think Wei still has his problems, and he's overeager, and he doesn't quite link up with especially Mako very well, but I think Rookie in particular really benefits a lot from the way that Wei plays, and so you can kind of accept it. You can kind of understand why maybe they would want to go in that direction, but overall, IG are a real threat. This is a Worlds team right now, regardless of whether or not you think that they are a top 2 or top 3 or anything like that type of roster, but for Top Esports, this team kind of really needed to keep their momentum going. They had a gigantic win earlier this week, and it feels like they've lost a lot of that momentum now. This is one of the better teams in the world in terms of their actual talent level. Are they able to bring it out on a game-to-game basis? The answer to that seems to be no, and we've seen that from them throughout the entirety of this year, and that's why I think fans are just so frustrated, alongside, of course, the history of this organization. But when you see players like Kanavi play so well in this series, and even Jackie Love play relatively well in this series, you wonder why Top Esports can't pick up wins like this, but it's because the solo laners this time are the ones that are underperforming. 369 comes off of his best series of the split immediately into his worst of the entire split, getting trounced by the Shy on the top side. He's dead of the series here. He was not particularly relevant in any of these games. In fact, he barely involved himself in any of the positive plays that Top Esports made. And then you're going to talk about Cream, who's taken 14 major steps back over the course of 2025. I think he's gotten worse every single game that he's played over the course of this year. He was pretty good. In fact, I would say really good in winter, and I was really liking his tape from last year. And then spring comes around and it's up and down. The form's not quite as consistent as maybe you would want it to be. And in summer, he's just not been good. Like, there's nothing else to say. I don't know what's going on with Cream, but all of his positive momentum has basically fallen off of a cliff. And I get that this team is playing for jungle and bot lane more, which is a positive because I think Jackie Love has been an MVP candidate, but you have to get something out of your solo lanes. If 369 is rolling threes, especially after he just rolled nines, and if Cream is going to be one of the weaker mid laners in Group Ascend, which right now he kind of is, then top esports are going to have a hard time actually competing to win the league like they want to. This should be a team that's competing to be number one, not competing to be relevant, and that's kind of the problem right now. I still think both of these teams are top four, but the circle of suck, even at the top of the LPL, certainly comes full. It always comes around, is I guess the way that I'll put it, and Invictus are the ones benefiting from that right now. But that's going to bring us to our 7th and final day of action here in the LPL in week number 5, and I'm excited to jump into day 7 because both matchups were absolutely ginormous. The first one, Weibo Gaming taking on anyone's Legend, and AL are going to continue their hot streak. I very tentatively am back on board when it comes to AL in terms of them being the number 1 team in the LPL. I think we were all just waiting for them to figure themselves out, and it looks like they have done so, but I want to make sure that I'm not overhyping a team that still has problems, because this team definitely is not perfect in every single way. They still have things they need to improve, and they still have ways they need to get better, but at least for now, there are a lot of positives in terms of how they're playing the game, and Weibo just didn't really have an answer to those positives in terms of how they played. They are clearly outside the top 4. I'd love to lambast Weibo like everybody else, but I don't see them as a Worlds team, and so I don't really see this as a problem in terms of their result. Obviously, they'd love to be able to compete with the top 4, but they're not there right now, and so them kind of getting blasted in both of these games, not being particularly competitive, it's not really all that surprising. Let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the series is going to go to Tarzan in the jungle. I want to make this clear, like, I know I'm kind of, known as the Tarzan guy, like, I'm very biased towards Tarzan, he's my favorite player in the world, yada, yada, yada. Like, I consider him arguably the best jungler in the world. I've seen people talk about Tarzan in a way that I do not agree with over the course of this split, and I mean too positively. I think, generally speaking, Tarzan has been given too much leniency for how he has played for AL at the beginning of this split. From my perspective, and I know this is not how a lot of people see it, Tarzan has been the reason that AL is losing games. Like, it is really tough to watch the series that AL ends up throwing away at the beginning of this split and not see Tarzan running it in a lot of points. There are 3 or 4 series where you can actively look at Tarzan and just question, like, what are you doing? Like, what is going on? Why are you doing the thing that you are doing? Why are you playing so inconsistently? And that's been a part of Tarzan's game. Basically, his whole career, he's always had stretches of time where he's just been rather inconsistent. And I see some people online that are like, oh, Tarzan has been good for AL the whole time. It's the rest of the team that's been inting him, and there's a lot of things going on. I couldn't disagree more with that take, and I've said it multiple times in videos in the past over the course of this split. I think Tarzan is the reason AL wins, and Tarzan is the reason AL loses. Like, the entirety of this team is an extension of Tarzan. As much as I love players like Kyle, and I think Hope's in good form, and, Shanks has been good, and Flandra has been good, like, if Tarzan's not a world-class jungler, this team is not competing to win the LPL. That is the difference between them being great and them not being great. So Tarzan stepping up here today and being better than TN, former world champion TN, that's massive for AL, and it's really necessary for him to play this way with the Wukong, with the Pantheon, the aggressive picks that can actually do something, because when Tarzan is taken off of his game and out of form, when he's not able to do the things that he feels comfortable on, this team does not win. That has become very, very clear to me throughout this split, and I'm not going to say it's that simple, but it certainly does feel like Tarzan is the make or break player for anyone's Legend, just like they kind of had last year with Krako, but this team's much better than the team they had last year. So it is what it is. Tarzan's a much better player than Krako in that regard. They just have to get a good performance out of the jungle position, because no one else on this team is going to 1v9 in the same kind of way. That being said, if you put Hope and Kyle in a good position, they're going to be able to step up and do something about it, and they were better, much better than the Weibo bot lane in this series. Now, the Weibo bot lane's been a disaster. I think Crisp has been okay, but my feelings on Light at this point, if you've watched the video, I'm very low on what his production has been over the course of this year. Hope and Kyle were better than them. Shanks was certainly the better mid laner in this series, which is necessary when going up against against Weibo, because if you can't take Xiaohu out of his own game, Weibo feels a lot more comfortable to play the map in the way that they like to play it. Shanks was much better, and that meant that less options were on the table for Weibo. Flandra on the top side, you know, he had a great game 1 on the Rumble, not as good of a game 2 on the Renekton. You can live with that. Like, you can take the good with the bad when it comes to a top laner, but really, when you talk about AL, the entire conversation starts and ends with Tarzan. He is the player that determines whether or not they can win the LPL, and when he is on, they're not only going to win it, they're going to dominate the LPL because he's that good of a player. But for Weibo on the other side, again, a lot of fingers you can point. I think everybody was kind of bad in this series. You can point it to Light. I think that's very fair down in the bot lane. It's never good to have the most deaths on the team when you're the AD carry. You can, point it to Tien, who got completely jungle gapped by Tarzan playing 2 of his more comfortable champions in the Skarner and the Trundle. I think that's pretty bad. Breathe only participated in 5 kills throughout the entirety of this series. That is very, very bad, but I'm giving it to Crisp because I think his engage angles were just a little too bad. Crisp giveth and Crisp taketh away. I know people hate this guy. I can't bring it in me to hate this guy. I think that there are a lot of worse supports in the LPL. Support's just not a particularly good position in the LPL, and it's always been a bit of a tough one to try and find supports who will do anything. Crisp is just overly aggressive. He's going to look for plays, and sometimes those plays aren't going to work out. You can live with that in terms of how you build the rest of your team. Sometimes it's not going to work, though, especially against teams that counter a lot of the aggressive tendencies that he ends up showing, and that's what happened here. So for me, Crisp is going to get dead of the series mostly for that Rel game in game 2. Like I said, though, Light not good, Tien not good, Breathe, Xiaohu, like all of them got beat. This was AL, kind of dominating across the map, really playing through jungle and then spreading it out everywhere else. So Weibo, not top 4. Who would have seen that coming except for everyone? And AL actively fighting to get back to number 1 in my power rankings, and they did just about everything they needed to do this week in order to get there again. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in our second series of day number 7. And it was a battle between the top 2 teams in my power rankings to close out the week. It was Bilibili Gaming taking on Top Esports. And Top Esports is going to take this series 2-0. They are not going to drop a single game to Bilibili, who ends up really struggling across this week. I know some people are going to really overreact. I've said my piece. I think this week is better for BLG than people are giving them credit for, but this is certainly the worst series they played across this week. They were competitive and arguably better against AL. They just couldn't end up closing out game number 3 with some bad decisions. They were just straight up better against Weibo Gaming, where they were able to take that series even though they dropped a game. And then here, unfortunately, against Top Esports, it does kind of come to a crawling halt, and Top Esports gets back on the board after a really frustrating loss just the day before to Invictus. Pretty big win here for TES, and we'll get to it from their side first. Oh boy, what a series for Kanavi. Absolutely, he's going to be your player of the series. The dude pulls out Zed in game 2 and completely dominates on it. We've seen multiple times over this Zed champion be picked and be entirely useless, even by Shadow on the other side of this. I think Tarzan has a pretty, notorious Zed performance, and Kanavi being able to pull it out here and being really one of the first junglers, maybe outside of like Owner, who actually does look good on Zed is really cool. I'm excited for Kanavi. He's such a fun player to watch, and I get that he has this reputation where the community tends to not trust in him quite as much as they do other star players. I can't get behind that. I just like this guy too much. I think his playstyle is way too fun, and I think we saw that here in the second game that he completely obliterated, by the way. This was a 1v9 type of Zed game. Not that he had to 1v9, the rest of the team was also very good here, but it really was a Zed performance for the ages for Kanavi, and that absolutely is worthy of a player of the series nod. Now, 369 was also excellent on this Cassante, basically unkillable in game number 2. Really bounced back after that terrible series against IG. He was great earlier on in the week, and he was great here. I'm going to believe that he's fine moving forward, but I'm not going to forget that this guy is just naturally inconsistent, and certainly towards the end of the year, he can have his pitfalls in terms of the way he plays the game, and so it's good to see that he has multiple good performances this week, one against Bin, who's been in very good form, but, I'll be keeping my eye on 369. That's definitely the case. I think the other player that played awesome this series, Hong, in the support position. This guy's not been getting nearly enough credit for how well Top Esports has been playing. Are there moments and times where he ends up being, decently behind the scenes and irrelevant because, Jackie Love or Kanavi or 369 are taking over? Absolutely, but isn't that the job of a support? And also, if Jackie Love's having this, MVP type of split where I believe he is currently currently leading in the MVP leaderboard? Why are we not giving any credit to the fact that Hong has come in and basically completely revitalized a 2v2 that was terrible in the spring split? Jackie Love and Crisp were not good in the 2v2 last split, and they've become one of the best 2v2 bot lanes in the entire league with Hong coming back in. I feel like that absolutely deserves a major mention. His Alistair in game 1 was really fun to watch. He was able to create so much for top esports. Hong has upgraded this team by a pretty drastic margin, and I think that's become clearer and clearer every single game that we've watched. Jackie Love continues to be great. His KDAs are out of this world because the team protects him so well and he's not making stupid mistakes. Cream was playing like, basically no gold Annie. It was crazy watching this guy play fasting Annie in the mid lane where he was 2 items at 25 minutes in a game that his team was absolutely winning in. It's a very strange game, all things considered, from Cream, who continues to be a major question mark, but everything else on this top esports roster is going well at the moment, and that's why you kind of have to consider them arguably the best team in the entire league, even with the loss to Invictus Gaming. And then for BLG, this is the loss that I think, like I said, concerns me the most. I think that there were a couple of performances today that just were not good enough, specifically on the Karma. What a terrible game, too, from On. Karma has not had a ton of success here in the LPL. I think that's because lane-dominant 2v2s don't necessarily carry games in a meta where, late games are so prevalent, where games are going a lot later than they have in the past, or at least in the past couple of splits. And I think On just didn't play the Karma well. Like, I hate to just make it so simple, but he's an engaged player. He's a playmaker. He's the kind of guy that wants to go and create action for the team. Putting him on something like Karma, I think, takes away a lot of his ability to play well on teams like this. And I think he was terrible in game 2. So he is getting dead of the series, very obviously. I will defend On's split. I think he's been very good for BLG this split during their undefeated run, but this was not a good series. Shadow also deserves criticism. This is the second time this week where it really has felt like he's been outplayed, at least to a smaller extent. Kanavi is incredible, and obviously, losing to Kanavi and Tarzan, like, that's not going to be the end of the world. That's not like, ring every alarm bell in the entire universe, but this is a team that does want to be able to compete with these other two teams, and they just weren't able to do it. Shadow did look worse this week than he has at any point in the split up until this point. I think Bin struggled on the top side. 369 was certainly better in that second game. Knight was maybe the better mid laner, but did it even really matter? Like, he was still getting caught out and dying in team fights. Elk, I think, was doing a lot of damage, but also couldn't really push the game forward in any meaningful way. And Jackie Love was more relevant on the other side in terms of what he was able to generate with his own laning phase. So BLG just end up feeling like they're underwhelming in a series like this. And I get it. It's a circle of suck right now at the top of the LPL. I've talked about it a lot. Everybody beats everybody in the LPL, but this is a damning loss for BLG, and it really does affect my opinion of them right now. And for top esports, this is a massive win. It does kind of catapult them back up in my brain in terms of where they're at. I was going to be really low on them coming out of the Invictus series. Pretty hard to do that now after this win. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Week 5 overview and analysis video here in the summer split. Again, the penultimate one, because we've only got one more after this. Weeks 6 and 7 will be combined into one video because Week 7's like 4 games or whatever, 4 series, so I'll just put it all in one video later next week. We are really getting towards the end of the LPL, and you can see that here in the updated standings after 5 weeks of action. Teams already qualifying for specific spots. We've got teams qualifying for the play-ins. We've got one team already locked for top 4 and for the playoffs. They've guaranteed themselves the avoidance of a play-in stage no matter how bad things get. And we also have updates to my power rankings, which you can see to the right of every single team. Change is going to be how they have changed from last week to this week. We can go over risers and fallers. Now, at the top of the standings, we are going to have quite a bit of movement because jumping up to number 1, it is going to be anyone's legend. I'm all back in on the train on AL. As long as Tarzan is playing well, this team is going to be just fine. And Tarzan was very, very good throughout a lot of this week. If he is going to play like the best jungler in the world, this team will perform like one of the best teams in the world. They just needed some time to get going, and I think they've gotten back. But this is a very tentative number 1 placing because I still don't really trust this team in its entirety. Top Esports is going to stay at number 2 for now. BLG did concern me. I think if that series had been a bit closer against TES, maybe I would have considered keeping them around at number 2. But as of right now, BLG kind of have to move down to number 3, and Top Esports have to move to number 2. Invictus Gaming, despite beating Top Esports, are still going to move down to number 4 because at the end of the day, they're still the team I feel the least confident is going to make Worlds out of these 3. I can pretty much lock in AL, TES, and BLG in terms of my projected Worlds teams. IG somehow, some way feel like a team that could still choke at the end of the day. I don't think they're going to do that. They've shown me no signs that they're going to do that, and it does feel like a big 4 right now in the LPL, but that's why IG ends up falling to number 4 despite the fact that they beat Top Esports. But No other major changes, I would say, throughout the upper part of the power rankings. Weibo will stay at 5. They are the clear number 5 team. And JDG will stay at 6. They are the clear number 6 team. I think those teams are basically by themselves in their own tiers. I think Weibo is worse than the top 4, but better than JDG. I think JDG is clearly better than everybody else, but clearly worse than Weibo Gaming. So it just ends up kind of being what it is. Everything else is shifting, though. Ninjas in Pyjamas going to be jumping up to number 7 with their win over Edward Gaming, who falls down to number 8. That means WE falls down to number 9. I now do not project WE as even a playoff team. I think that they would lose a series to Ninjas in Pyjamas if they did have to go up against them. Right now, NIP are in first place in Group Nirvana, but if you can see those games, they've played 2 more series than Edward Gaming, and that means that, you know, if EDG go perfect the rest of the split, they're going to be better than where NIP is at in terms of their game score. They're going to take that number 1 spot, which means they would face FPX, which right now is absolutely the easier and more winnable series. The only other change is that Ultra Prime leapfrogs Thunder Talk in the power rankings because they beat them. That feels pretty obvious. Ultra Prime have a pretty clear path to number 4 in the group now, and Thunder Talk are on the outside looking in unless something crazy happens. So those are my power rankings. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. Very curious to know what your thoughts and opinions are down there, but let's go ahead and get into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 5 here. Player of the week, it is going to go to Nio, the jungler for Ninjas in Pyjamas. NIP had a crazy good week, and honestly, almost all of it was off the back of Nio just being really, really good in the jungle for this team. Really excited to get to cast him later tonight against LNG. Not exactly the most, I guess, tempting matchup of worst versus first right now in Group Nirvana, but getting to see Nio play is always a treat, and we saw it on multiple styles. The Viego a couple of times, both versus Ultra Prime and versus Edward Gaming, and then things like the Vi and the Skarner that are full setup tools. It just feels like everything is working right now for Nio, and it does feel like he's completely upgraded what Ninjas in Pyjamas is as a team, so more than deserving of player of the week. And then my honorable mentions, Kanavi, the jungler for Top Esports, especially after that Zed game, it's really hard not to give him an honorable mention for player of the week. If they didn't lose to IG, then I would give it even more of an honorable mention. He probably would be player of the week if they just won that series, but he even played fine against IG. He was the best player on Top Esports in that series. And then Kyle, the support for Anyone's Legend, is going to be the other honorable mention this week, despite the fact that they were not, the most perfect and most flawless team in the entire universe. I still want to give AL credit, and Kyle, I think, still is the driving force for a lot of their macro plays. So Kanavi and Kyle are my honorable mentions. And then my dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to go to Jiachi, the AD carry for FunPlus Phoenix. He just didn't have a very good week. I still think he's a pretty decent player with good amounts of upside, but FPX is crumbling everywhere right now with the jungle position being completely in flux, and it's seeming like, everything backstage just going wrong. It's not surprising to see somebody on the team end up underperforming, and quite frankly, everybody on that team is underperforming right now. I just think Jiachi was the most out in front of that. So Jiachi is going to be my dud of the week for week 5, and Nio is going to be my player of the week, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're going to be covering, like I said, week 6 and 7 in one video later next week, but we're covering all of the playoffs on this channel as well for the LPL and the 3 other major regions that we cover, so LTA North, LEC, and LCK. We're also covering the NACL Tier 2 over in North America, so if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. But as I said before, we're still casting for LPL English. If you want to see my thoughts on this league live, I'm casting tonight as this video goes live. Check out the links in the description to YouTube, to Twitch, follow, subscribe, do all that stuff if you are interested. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all